morning, Crossing Church family. How's everybody doing this morning? Everybody awake, ready to roll? Yeah, he is. Anybody else? No, I'm just kidding. Good morning. I hope everybody's had a good morning so far. My name is Jai. I'm the student pastor here on staff at the Crossing, and we've been in a teaching series called Just a Little Sin. Because if we're honest with ourselves, we have some sins in the Bible or some sins in our life that if we're a little more okay with those. If they come and go in our life from time to time, we're like, that's not really that big of a deal. You know, we can play it off, make it kind of a little sin. And so we've been talking about all these different little sins. And if that's the first time you've seen that bumper video, you're like, that's a little creepy, right? Like that's a little. And it's like that for a point, right? That we say it's just a little sin. But we should begin to see sin as a little creepy. That when we let it into our lives and we're okay with it, it begins to fester and it begins to brew and eventually begins to take us down. And if we'd be okay with just these little sins. So each week we've been talking about just these different little sins. And this week the sin is the little sin of gluttony. Right? The little sin of gluttony. And I'm sure that I could assume that you all know what gluttony is, but I'm going to go ahead and not make that assumption and go with a working definition of gluttony so we're all working on the same page here, all right? So, gluttony, eating or drinking in excess above and beyond what is needed. And most of you probably realize that it is really awkward to talk about gluttony, right? Like last week, Kenny said, if you just want to make everybody in the church mad, talk about money. And I'm like, try telling them to eat less food. Like, that's like fighting words in my household, right? Like, you tell me to eat less food, I'm going to punch you in the nose. Like, you just don't tell somebody. Like, you could try right now, turn to your neighbor and tell them to eat less food. No, don't do it. You'd be limping out of church today. Seriously though, like I'll tell my wife, I'll say, hey, for a little while here, I'm just going to eat really clean, right? I'm going to eat really clean, and she'll just give me the typical, like the eye roll, right? Okay, whatever. And she'll be like, don't get mad when I hold you accountable. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not going to get mad. And so we'll literally a day or two later, we'll be at Frisch's and, sitting down, just eating lunch or whatever. And at this point in time, so she's like, Jai, you said you were going to eat really clean, really careful. Like, don't overdo it. Don't overeat or whatever. So I'm sitting there with my arms crossed, trying not to act mad, but I'm mad, right? You just don't tell me not to eat. And so my kids think this is hilarious. So my son begins to dangle bacon in front of me. And I'm like, that is not cool. You don't dangle bacon in front of dad. Like, you better quit. And he kept dangling it, so I ate it. And I'm like, I'm not going to sit around where you just dangle bacon in front of me and think I'm not going to eat it, right? I'm going to eat it. And so, yeah, I like bacon. But my real problem is not bacon. My real problem is donuts. I love donuts. Like, the student ministry rarely goes a week without hearing me probably talk about donuts. I really like donuts, to the point to where, I was a little kid. This has been since a little kid. I would go and, my mom and dad buy a box of donuts. I'd go down 2 or 3 in the morning. I'd eat the entire box of donuts, and then I would go back to bed. My family would get up, and they'd be all like, "We're at donuts," and there's this empty box and crumbs. And where'd the donuts go? And I don't know. Where'd the donuts go? And I'm playing this off, but my parents we know exactly where the donuts went. Jai ate them. And so they started eventually taking the donuts and hiding them under their bed, in their bedroom, because I had such a problem with this. I would creep in their bedroom at night and try to get their box of donuts. That's how much I liked donuts. But then, actually my bucket list item that I got to mark off was a donut bacon cheeseburger. It was awesome. I'm not going to lie. I would go hands down, eat one right now. They're the best. I might even do it for the student ministry sometime this summer. I'll let that out of the bag. But a donut bacon cheeseburger. But since I've moved to Cincinnati, you all have corrupted me. Now, donuts aren't my struggle anymore. My struggle is cronuts. Did you just drop that? I'm so glad that I work with a lead pastor that has the same struggles that I do, apparently. So this is a cronut. If you have never had a cronut, then they apparently didn't introduce you to Cincinnati like they did to me. I think they knew I had a donut problem.
There was a dozen, but now it's a pastor's dozen because there's only about 8 or 9 left. So,
if you're very nice to me after the service, you might get a cronut. All right, everybody. Thank you, Kenny. I appreciate the help. He's very quick to sign up for sermon illustrations like this. I noticed. We might have the same problems. So this is, donuts are awesome. I love them. This is definitely it for me. Like, this is it for me. What is it for you? What is it for you? When you start thinking about food, you start thinking about drinks, like, what is it for you? Like, for some of you, it's red meat. Like, how many of the red meat guys in the room, like, you love red meat? You're like, steak, I could eat a steak every day, right? Ribs. Some of you are meat people, like, you really like your red meat. What do you overindulge in? Is it pastries? Maybe pastries? Chocolate? I apparently found out our executive pastor HUD is Slim Jims. Like, really? Slim Jims is your thing? All right. Is it Coke? Like soda? My dad loves Mountain Dew. Like I know if he's coming to visit, I might as well just put Mountain Dew in the refrigerator. I'm going to hear it, right? He loves Mountain Dew or sweet tea. Went through a phase where I was like really like sweet tea. What is it for you? Is it beer? Is it wine? What is your overindulgence? It's not that food or drink itself is bad. It's the excess of it. Or the excess of it. And I joke. But let me be very, very clear on this before we go forward. This is not a weight-shaming message. That is not what this is about. I've been 60 pounds heavier than I am now today, and I've been lighter than I am today. And in both phases of life, I struggled with this. But there's been days where I've woken up in the morning and the first thing on my brain is food. To the point to where sometimes where we would need to go out to go to some family function or some church function, and literally my wife can tell you, I've had conversations with her where I would not leave the house until I knew where we were going to eat, what I was going to eat, and had consumed my life. Everything came down to food and drinks. This is not about our weight. It's not the bottom line of where I'm going with this. So gluttony, eating or drinking in excess above and beyond what is needed. Like, some of us do it because our parents offered the Clean Plate Club. Anybody in the Clean Plate Club? How many of you still do that to your kids today? Or how many of your parents did that to you, right? The Clean Plate Club became a habit of just doing that. Some of us overindulge because we consider ourselves a foodie. Anybody a foodie where you're like, I'm just a connoisseur of food. I like to go around and see all the different cultural foods, all the different ways that you can make this or that, add this in, and how it changes the taste. You just really like food. Some of us do it because we love money. You ever connected it to money before? Because you went to a buffet and you got one plate of food and you ate it. And in your mind, you're like, I paid $9.99 for this. This one plate. I'm going back to at least get a second or third plate, right? Like it's because it's a money issue for you. Some of us, it's because we can't stand waste, right? So you order this meal for your kid and they have like 2 or 3 bites and you're like, there are starving kids in Africa right now. And you're not going to waste that. And so is dad. You just like start shoveling it in. And all your kids are going, how did that just help the kid in Africa? Like, what? Because you could eat it? Like, so it's some of it comes down to the idea or mindset of waste. We struggle with it. Or some of us overindulge in food or drink because it's an addiction. And I have 100% been there before. I was addicted to it. Whether we want to own up to it or not, whether we believe it or not. We're addicted to it. See, not only is gluttony a church-approved sin, it's actually encouraged. I mean, stop and think, when's the last time you've went to a church gathering or a church function there wasn't food there, right? It's everywhere. It's in everything that we do. Food is there. Matter of fact, I remember my very first ministry. I was at a church in Indiana. I was a youth and children's pastor, and I was kind of getting in with the staff, getting to know the culture of the church, because every church is just a little bit different, and so the pastors would take me out to lunch, and we'd do things together. And I remember one of the first few times that I actually ordered a grilled chicken salad, and you would have thought that I had abused the waitress, because they read me the riot act. And they're like, you've got to be kidding. Like, when are you going to grow up and eat big boy food one day? That changed some things for me mentally. And how I saw these guys, and how I had this relationship with food, and how I thought about it. Like, that started another trajectory for me that was very unhealthy in the way that I connected with food. See, church, we encourage it. But as a church family, we cannot afford to bury our heads in the sands and say that it's not a problem, or say that gluttony is not a sin, or take the scriptures that we're going to read this morning and cut them out of the Bible and just say we don't have to deal with those. We can't do those things. Gluttony is a sin. This is what John Owen says. He says, be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. See, sin doesn't remain stagnant. It festers, it grows, and it can begin to take us down. And so King Solomon, he writes, as the wisest man ever, he writes in the book of Proverbs. He's in this area of Proverbs. It's like these 30 wise sayings. And this is what he says in chapter 23, verse 1. He says, when you sit to dine with a ruler, note well what is before you. Just kind of saying, hey, you're going to be presented with lots of options in life. Sure, in food and drinks, but all really different areas of life. You're going to be presented with all these different options. You just proceed with caution, right? Note what's been put before you and look at it carefully. And then he takes this quick rated R turn. And he says in verse 2, and put a knife to your throat if you're given to gluttony. Wow. That just elevated really quickly. Like, really? Why such extremes? I think it's because there's some serious warning signs, especially surrounding food, even in Scripture, that we just keep blowing past the warning signs. Just keep blowing on right by them. And see, God created us to be able to thrive in life, not just survive, but sometimes when it comes to our food and drink, we ignore the warning signs. Like, here's one of the warning signs I saw just this week when it came to the news. This post I found, it says, unhealthy diets now kill more people than tobacco or high blood pressure. Even the science field and the health field industry keeps putting up the warning signs for us, and we just keep blowing right past them. See, part of growing spiritually, right, is to see the warning signs, allow God's truth to speak into our life, and begin to make the shifts and the changes that we need to make. So some of you are honestly thinking, they're like, really, Jai? Food, drinks, like, aren't there bigger fish to fry? Is this just a healthy living, we're going to live longer, like shallow living, healthily message that you want us to buy into, to live a little bit longer, a little healthier, lose some weight? Is that what you're trying to get at here? This is what Paul says. He's writing the city of Corinth, and he says in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? He says, who lives in you and was given to you by God. He says, you do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price. It cost him his son. He says, so you must honor God with your what? With your body. God cares about our body and what we do to it and what we put in it. He cared about it enough to let his Spirit live inside of it, to let his son die for it. It cost him everything. So the bottom line is that God has blessed us with a body, right? He's blessed us with a body, and he expects us to manage it. So if you get sick, he expects you to manage that, right? To go and get the medicines that you need to take. If you get injured, he expects you to go and take care of yourself, do the right things so your body can begin to heal itself. He said, but when we give ourselves the gluttony and we aren't careful, then essentially we're being dishonorable to God and what he's done for us, and the blessing he's given to us with our body. And so how do we slay the sin of gluttony? Right, how do we do this? How do we fight against this? And so we're going to look at an event in the life of a man named Daniel. But before we get to the verses that we're going to get to, right, Daniel, he is living in Jerusalem with God's people, the Israelites. And at this point in time, though, they had begun to see sin as lots of really, really little sins. And they stopped worshiping God. They started embracing sin and started worshiping a lot of other false gods. And they started doing all these things, and so King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was able to go in and overtake the people. He was able to conquer them. But not because he was powerful, but because God allowed it. Because his people weren't worshiping him. Sin was okay in their eyes. So he allowed them to go in and take over his people, Jerusalem, conquer the city, and he takes Daniel and a whole bunch of people back to Babylon. And he said, and then he begins, not only do that, he says, hey, I want you to gather up some of the wisest, brightest, strongest young men, and I want you to begin to train them to be in the Babylonian army. And so he says, hey, there's going to be some things we're going to reteach you, like the Babylonian education. You're going to go through this 3-year process. And one of those processes, we're actually going to give you a healthy ration of food and drink and wine, all the best foods from the king's table. And we're going to give that to you. We want you to eat that as a part of your preparation. And this is what Daniel says in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. He says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine given to them by the king. So he asked the chief of staff for permission to not eat these unacceptable foods. See, I find it really interesting that Daniel's entire life has just changed. And he's a youth at this point. He's probably a teenager. And he's being literally for 3 years going through this Babylonian brainwashing, everything that they agree with in Babylon's lifestyle, what he's going through in his life is being changed. And the one thing that he puts his foot down and says, let me not do this. It all came down to the food and drink. And so I think we need to take a page out of Daniel's playbook when it comes to culture and food and drinks, and we need to rethink our relationship with food and drinks. We need to rethink our relationship with it. Now, like if Sarah and I, so Sarah's our children's pastor, if Sarah and I, like we bring in donuts to the children's ministry or the youth ministry, let's just be honest that they love us, right? And you're like, oh, Sarah and I, they're such good pastors. They love our kids. They're like, bring them in, everybody's excited, oh, it's donuts. But if I brought in little baggies of white powder with cocaine and say, okay, kids, today we're going to do cocaine. You'd have us in handcuffs in a cop car, and on the evening news that night, you'd be watching, oh, Jai and Sarah, hi. Do you realize that the processed sugar that we eat in our food and drinks does the exact same thing to the human brain that cocaine does? The exact same thing. That each time then you eat something with processed sugar or you take cocaine, that it triggers in our minds, this releases the chemical of dopamine in our body, and it says, oh, that was good, do it again. It's the pleasure center of the brain. It says, do it again. And so we eat or we drink, and what do? We do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again. As a matter of fact, surveys and a lot of science and research has shown today that actually that the processed sugar that we eat is 8 times more addictive than cocaine is. And so we're beginning to see our family members and our friends literally slowly destroying ourselves from the inside out. This is what Ann Wigmore says. She says, the foods you eat can either be the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison? We weren't raised with that mindset, were we? See, God has designed our bodies in a way that when we put the right things in, when we put in vegetables and fruits and lean proteins and the right types of food, that actually God designed our body to heal itself. But the same is also true when we continue to put in the wrong things over and over and over again. It begins to slowly poison ourselves. Did you know that most of the food industry does not exist for food? Like when you stop and think about it, sure, they make food, we eat it, or they make food and we buy it and eat it, but they don't exist for food. The food industry exists for money. That they will spend thousands of dollars just to figure out to put the right additives or the right additives into our food and into our drinks so that you'll turn around and be addicted to it and you'll go back and you'll buy more and you'll buy more, and to the point to where they'll make millions off of us. We need to rethink the relationship with the food and the industry. Like Daniel, we can't just buy into culture and what they're selling us. We need to rethink it. And back to verse 8, it says, but Daniel was determined. Right? He was determined. He's not to defile himself by eating the food and the drink by the king. See, Daniel recognized, he said, hey, I realize that I don't have a lot of choices or a lot of say in some of the things that are going on in my life, but right now nobody's force feeding me. And so I'm going to begin to kind of put my foot down here. I'm determined to do this. So he had this character trait that he was growing inside of himself, even as a young man, that we need to work on and continue to grow. We need to grow in self-discipline. We need to grow in self-discipline. Literally, the very essence of overindulging in something is not being able to tell ourselves no. And I get it. We live in a culture where we're like, why do I want to tell myself no? Right? Like we don't want to tell ourselves no. Most of us don't enjoy the idea of telling ourselves no. But self-discipline is this controlling our desires and being able to do the things that we plan to do. But if we're honest, a lot of us look at self-discipline and we say, that's the enemy, right? I don't want to be self-disciplined. And this is what self-discipline is. I saw this pastor quote this. He says, self-discipline is not my enemy. He says, my refusal to continually surrender to Jesus makes me my worst enemy. He said, and I'll never recognize the villain unless I look in the mirror. I don't know about you, but that right there in me, I'm the enemy, myself, and if I can't control myself, it's me. And with every act of self-discipline, I begin to gain confidence, I begin to trust myself more, I begin to trust God more, and lean more into his truths and what he says, that he has given me a spirit of power. And guess what that spirit of power produces as fruit in my life? Of self-control, and that I can govern over my own life, and that I can control myself in one step at a time. And for some of us, though, if this for you gets to the point where it did for me, it's an addiction. And you might be at this point where you're a little bit beyond the self-control thing, that your spirit of power may be to grab the other people around you and say, this is an addiction for me, I need help. Because there's no shame in asking out for help and gathering people around you and say, hey, this is a problem. Help me with this. So reach out and get help for it. So Daniel, he's determined, right? He's not going to eat the food. He's not going to drink the wine. But the attendant responded this way, the chief of staff who's overseeing all the training that's going on. He says in verse 10, he says, I'm afraid that my lord the king, who's ordered that you eat this food and drink this wine, like if you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, like I'm afraid the king is going to take my head. Like I'd say that's a pretty reasonable thing to think about. Like, he's worried about his life and his those things. So we've got these 2 point of views that is really going on. Like, Daniel has his point of view, and he's like, hey, God has taught us that what is right for us to eat, how to take care of our bodies, how to take care of our life. And I know what it's like this is our culture, the way God's taught us to do food. And you got the chief of staff over here on this side saying, hey, sure, I don't want to lose my head, but also, like, this is the king's food. This is the king's nutrition. Like, this is going to be, in general, what's best for you. This is my Babylonian culture of food mindset. I need you to understand that. That's what's right. But if you really look down into what's happening, the tension isn't only about food. It's the response to the food. They know what's going to happen. And he said, hey, I can't have like a bunch of skinny, wimpy little soul. Like, you're going to fight in the king's army, right? Like, you've got to be able to actually do battle and fight against somebody and win. And he's like, so the response of the food to your body, I know what it's going to do. And so this is what they're talking about. And Daniel and the chief of staff, they understand this concept that, right, our consumption of food and drinks, like, they affect the other areas of our lives. Like, it affects the other areas of our lives. Like, again, God designed us to thrive, but when we continue to give in to gluttony and food and drinks and it's out of control, it begins to affect the other areas of our lives in a negative way. So a couple years ago, God had convicted me of this so much that I ended up writing a book on it. It's called Stronger, The Daily Battle for Growth. And for me, my health, my physical health, the food, the way I treated my body, it was one of the very last things that I finally submitted to the Lordship of Jesus. Like, I was like, God, you can have all these other areas. I'll submit to you my relationships and how I treat people. I'll submit to you my thought life, food, drink, exercise, how I take care of myself. That's me. This is my body. I do what I want. And when I fully submitted that over to him, I realized how much it was affecting the other areas of my life. The leadership has let me put it out there in the lobby. If you want to grab a copy on the way out, you can. If you don't, that's the general idea behind it, is that it affects this. When we look at this consumption of food and drinks, it affects the other areas of our lives. Like, just stop and think about it. Like, our mental life. Have you ever been at work and you just got done eating this big cheeseburger and drank this soda or a massive thing of sweet tea with all this sugar, and you're like, why can't I focus? Like, why can't you've got the sugar crash, right? Anybody ever been at the sugar crash? And you're like, oh, this is horrible. Like, why do I keep doing this to myself? Like, we do it. We do the sugar crash. Or if you've seen it affect your emotions, if you ever emotionally ate, like, you're upset about something, and so you eat, or you're emotionally happy about something, so you emotionally eat, and you're like, this is not helping. Obviously it affects our physical health and what it does to it, but you ever know that it can affect your relational health? You ever heard of hangry? Anybody hangry right now? Like, so hungry you're angry, like you're like, hurry up already, I want to go eat. It's true, it affects us. Like, everybody's been most time in those car rides, right, with your family, and you're going down the road, and all of a sudden everybody just starts bickering at everybody, and like, I'll ask my kids, hey, you all where you want to eat? And they just start crying, and I'm like, they're like, I don't know, and I'm like, I just wanted to know where you wanted to eat. And it was like, Wendy's it is, like, next exit, right? You're like, we just got to get food in your bodies because they've gotten hangry. It can affect your relationships. It can affect your finances. When we get addicted, we continue to go back and spend more and more money on those addictions. See, it affects one of the areas. It affects all the other ones. So Daniel, he doesn't want to eat the food and drink. The attendant doesn't want to lose his head. I don't blame him. So what they do? Verse 12, it says, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. Daniel said, and he said, at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. It says, then make your decision in the light of what you see. See, Daniel's like, hey, I get it. I get that you're unsure about this whole scenario. I get it. You don't lose your head. Neither do I. So just hear me on this. Like, just test us. 10 days, veggie sticks, Voss water, whatever it is that you got. Like, just test us on this. and see what happens. Just make your decision in light of that. And really what he's teaching us is the equation for discipleship. That every single one, when we come and we hear God's word or we read God's word, it's the equation for discipleship. And this is what it is truth plus grace plus challenge equals discipleship. It's how we grow spiritually. No matter what's taught from this stage or what's taught from God's word, that we see these truths. And if we're honest, it's hard. Like, anybody willing to raise their hand to hear about gluttony and the truth about gluttony? It's hard to hear it. Truth is hard. That's what it's supposed to be when it's truth. It brushes up against us and we're like, ooh, that's kind of tough. But then God gives us grace. And he looks at us and says, I get it. It's hard. You know how bad I want to cram this entire box of cronuts into my mouth right now? It's hard. But God gives us grace. He says, I get it. We're going to walk through this thing. But he also says, but I'm not going to leave you behind just to stick in every single struggle that we have and just say that those things are okay. He says, no, I'm going to push you on and I'm going to challenge you on it. That's how you're going to grow, is when God challenges you and you're willing to work on this thing together and say, yeah, there's truth and there's grace, but there's challenge, and he pushes us through these things. And so what's the result of the 10-day test? So it says in verse 12, it says, at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and the wine provided for the others. See, I love that. I love to see that Daniel, even at a young age, said, God, I know you have things for me and my friends to do while we're in this foreign culture that doesn't embrace your word, that doesn't embrace your truths. I know we have kingdom work here to do that you're going to use us to do. And I'm going to make sure that, God, when you call me to do something, I'm ready. I'm ready to do it. So what could you be missing out on that God has for you because you're overindulging in food or drinks? What could you be missing out on? I was 24, 25 years old when me and my wife decided I was going to get a life insurance policy to take care of her if I died. Started thinking the whole end of life thing, which nobody enjoys that, right? So I finally agreed to it. I said, okay, I'll go get the life insurance policy. And part of that process is for them to come in, take a little bit of a physical, and they take some blood work and send that off and bring it back in. And so they contacted me like, okay, we have some results of your blood work and stuff. And they're like, we're going to be honest with you, it is not good news. I was like, okay, wasn't exactly expecting that at 24, 25 years old. They said, you're going to die at a very young age if something doesn't change. That was eye-opening. To think about the idea that I hadn't even been able to come close to having kids at that point in time in life. I still wanted to be a husband to my wife a lot longer. I wanted to have grandkids. I mean, I wanted to enjoy the life that God had given me. And honestly, for me, I wanted to do a lot more kingdom work. And God showed me in that time, that was the beginning for me of the process. He says, I have a lot more for you to do. But if you continue down this path, Jai, you're going to end up saying no to me because you're not going to want to do it. And one of the other eye-opening situations for me was I was on the beach at Florida with my kids, and they invited me to come up and get up and play with them. And I said no. I was tired. I had just got done, honestly, eating a huge lunch and a huge soda, and that opened my eyes as well. To think that I was losing out on that time with my kids because I wasn't working on myself, where God was saying, hey, there's some things, there's a better way to do it. You've bought into culture. Now I need you to change and see my way. It's hard. This isn't some look good in a bathing suit thing. I want to be, as I hope you want to be, ready. When God calls us to do something as a church, I don't want to give excuses. I want to say I've prepared myself. I've lived in a way that's honoring to you, that when you call me to move, I'm going to move. Let's pray. Father, this morning I joke.